So why would the Russians blow it up if they did, right? And again, we're not binary. We're not saying yes, the Russians did, no, the Ukrainians did not. The answer is this: you have to look back at what was actually going on with the operations of the pipeline, energy-wise, before this incident took place. And what had been happening was the Russians had cut the gas already in June of 2022 by 40%.
Hello everybody, today I'm delighted having a special guest in the channel. It is Dr. Benjamin Schmitt, who previously served as a European security advisor at the US Department of State. He is now a senior fellow at the University of Pennsylvania. He teaches on energy, geopolitics and national security in the USA, and he's an expert in clandestine Kremlin methods to infiltrate Western democracies and populations. It's a huge honor to welcoming you today in our channel. Benjamin, hello.
Thank you so much to be here. Glad to be here, Christoph.
My name, by the way, is Christoph Müller. I am the host of this channel, Talk for Ukraine in Germany. Please support my channel also by giving a like and subscribing also in the end when you found it informative what we are being taught. My first question to you, Benjamin, today would be about the Nord Stream pipeline. Who do you think was it? Who has blown it up?
Well, thank you so much, Christoph. And I know this has gripped, the transatlantic community and global democracies looking at this incident, because this was really one of the first major sabotage incidents that took place in Europe, especially since 2022, against energy and critical infrastructure. We've seen a lot of this go on. We've seen it onshore. We've seen it offshore. We've seen cables get cut. We've seen pipelines get blown up. We've seen electricity interconnectors get severed. And so the Nord Stream case is still gripping headlines because it remains one of the most high profile incidents of this. And so as a part of looking at this from an academic point of view, so I'm at the University of Pennsylvania. I work on energy, geopolitics, and national security. And so I launched in 2023 a project called Underwater Mayhem, which is aimed at countering sabotage against offshore energy and critical infrastructure across the NATO alliance and beyond. And the context for that is really important. It was launched after both basically the Nord Stream case took place, the incident took place, but also the 2022 Swalbart-Cable cut. What I think I'll do is, for the listeners, give a little bit of context of what that was like, and then dive into Nord Stream, pardon the pun.
Yeah, okay.
So in the case of Svalbard, on January 6th of 2022, just about 5 weeks before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a Russian fishing vessel, the Melkart 5, sailed over the southern of two subsea telecommunications cables connecting the Norwegian archipelago of Svalbard with the Norwegian mainland. So Svalbard's up near the North Pole, about 500 miles away.
This is Spitsbergen, which is called
Spitsbergen. Yes, you would say Spitsbergen.
Yeah.
And so a cable was ultimately cut after this fishing vessel sailed 120 some odd times over this southern of the two cables. It cut, and then this vessel sailed away. And so when we looked at this, I know that you've had General Ben Hodges on your channel, so we've had him and other military experts look at this in addition to the open source intelligence that we were able to review through commercial AIS and satellite data showing what the vessel's activity was. And we've concluded that this was a shaping operation. In other words, an operation by the Kremlin to undermine or prepare, let's say, the battle space before their full-scale invasion of Ukraine. You might say, well, what's the connection there? Well, Svalbard, or Spitsbergen, has the Svalsat station. This is the largest ground-based commercial satellite uplink station on the planet, and it's in a northerly latitude. So it's really a strategic location for commercial satellite data. And as we all know, and viewers of your channel know, Christoph, that of course, Ukraine would use commercial satellite data to its defense just weeks later, after Russia's full-scale invasion began in the end of February of 2022. They used things like Maxar and Planet for geospatial imagery to not only help their own military planning, but also to help diplomacy, to show the world the horrors of Bucha and Mariupol and these sort of large-scale war crimes that Russia was conducting, basically as soon as this full-scale invasion had begun. Yeah. And so that was going on. Of course, also the Ukrainians were ultimately going to use Starlink to help with their communication. So cutting a cable that would undermine, at least to some extent, the communications from that facility. I think it was a warning shot that the Kremlin fired at that point.
Yeah. Now, when you tell all these things, I remember that has been in the news those days also, and I think our problems in the West are always it is the amount of news which is coming in, which is so bad news, and people don't know how to react on it, and then the next news is coming, and then the next worse incident is happening. So what is lacking is an overall strategy on those things, because we have at those days. You are speaking of 2023, right? Now, and we are not aware how to react. We are too slow, I think.
Yeah, so that took place in 2022, and then these incidents continued in 2023. You're absolutely right. And so one of the things that has been a problem with all of these incidents, right? So we have the Swalbart-Cable cut in 2022, the September Nord Stream sabotage. You have the October 2023 dragging of an anchor through the Baltic Connector gas pipeline connecting Finland and Estonia, where a Chinese Hong Kong flag vessel, the Nunu Polar Bear, which of course had Russian ownership connections, was being escorted by a Russian nuclear-class icebreaker, the Sabotage, and dragged its anchor through that pipeline. We also, in the Gulf of Finland, and so we also had a vessel called the Yipeng 3, a Chinese vessel that cut cables in the central Baltic Sea, the BCS cable between Gotland and Lithuania, and the Sea Line 1 cable between Finland and Germany in November of 2024. And then on Christmas Day of 2024, there was a Russian Shadow Fleet vessel, the Eagle S, that cut the S-Link 2 cable, an electricity interconnector between Finland and Estonia. That was also sort of a shaping operation in our estimation, Christoph, because what was going on in the Baltic states just weeks later, they were planning to finally throw off the yoke of having been under the Russian, the Soviet, and then the Russian and Belarusian electricity grids, and finally synchronizing the Baltic states' electricity grids, with the EU. And so by cutting one of those cables, it increased the risk. It didn't stop the Baltic states, but it increased the risk to them as that operation was going on. And again, I think that Russia had intent there as well. So there's a lot of that going on. There's also cable cuts around Taiwan. I've been looking at in 2023 and 2025 in the Taiwan Strait and around the outlying islands of Taiwan, Penghu, Matsu, and near Keelung.
But in Taiwan, it's not the Russians, I guess, no?
It's the PRC. It's the PRC. So there's a case that took place, for example, last year in February of 2025, in which a PRC flag vessel, People's Republic of China, so Chinese vessel, that was loitering near a cable connecting the Taiwanese islands of Penghu, which are in the middle of the Taiwan Strait, with the main island of Taiwan. That's a cable operated by Chunghwa Telecom, the Taiwanese telecommunications provider. And they could tell that a vessel was nearby because the vibroacoustic environment was changing around the subsea fiber optic cable. And so they said, okay, Taiwanese Coast Guard, there is some sort of vessel loitering. You might want to take a look at this. And then a few hours later, that vessel dropped its anchor and sailed through and cut the cable between Taiwan and the Taiwanese islands of Penghu and the Taiwan Strait. And so the Taiwanese Coast Guard interdicted the vessel. They put the captain and crew on trial. Ultimately, the crew was deported back to China, and the captain is currently serving a 3-year jail sentence for sabotage for having dragged its anchor through that key communications cable.
So are these incidents connected? The PRC incidents around Taiwan and the Russian incidents which happened here in our North Sea, are they linked, or how do you see this global matter? They cut cables everywhere.
Yeah, well, no, I think that authoritarian nations are learning from each other. I don't necessarily think that this is a joined operation. In other words, operationally planned between Moscow and Beijing. But I think that China has learned from the Russian Federation on this front, and that Russia is learning from China on this front, right? Mm-hmm. So the Baltic Sea is seeing a lot of these incidents, and I think that part of the reason for that is it's a shallow sea, relatively shallow sea. It has a flat bottom, and there is a high density of critical infrastructure compared to the open ocean, and so it's an easier, lower cost target to drag an anchor and say, oh, it was an accident when we dragged an anchor and broke your critical infrastructure. And of course, the cables around Taiwan are vulnerable to that as well.
Which is, of course, not true. It's not an accident. It's on purpose. And that brings me to the question: who's able to do something against it? Usually it has been the Americans who have been responsible for being the world police, but now they are out being the world police.
Well, I don't know about being out. I mean, it's NATO Baltic Sentry was stood up, for example. So that was a NATO operation. It still is a NATO operation that's specifically focused on policing the Baltic Sea to push back on these subsea telecommunications and pipeline sabotage incidents. Mm-hmm. And I think it's been fairly successful. It's absolutely vital that this has happened, that they are out there doing this. But it's hard, Christoph. It's hard to police this amount and this length of critical infrastructure. Remember, subsea cables and pipelines, things like this, these are distributed infrastructure, thousands of kilometers, tens of thousands of kilometers that need to be simultaneously defended. It's a very, very difficult proposition. And so, although NATO has been out there, we've continued to see additional subsea cable cuts since that operation started. In November of 2025, so just last year, the Finnish district court in Helsinki released the captain of the Eagle S, that vessel that I talked about, that was a Russian Shadow Fleet vessel cutting one of the cables for the electricity connector, the S-Link 2 cable, the electricity interconnector between Finland and Estonia. They let him go, not because that they didn't think that this was a sabotage act or that wasn't the general motivation of letting him go. It was because that the district court didn't feel that Finland had the legal jurisdiction to prosecute because this took place in their exclusive economic zone, not in their territorial waters. And sure enough, 5 weeks later, the same thing happened. A Russian Shadow Fleet vessel, the Fitberg, dragged its anchors through cables in the exclusive economic zone again, and they had to interdict the vessel again in Finnish waters. And ultimately, we're going to have to see if that takes place and they're able to come to a different sort of result in the legal process.
What shall the Western countries do against those incidents? What measures do they have? Do they have to change their laws? Do they have to change their behavior?
I think they have to change. I don't know about changing their laws, but the interpretations of the laws absolutely need to be right-sized or justified for what's going on. Certainly, countries can't simply say it's open season on their infrastructure if it happens to sit outside of their territorial waters. That's really dangerous as a legal precedent and proposition. And so that's why what the Taiwanese did, right? So in the case of the Penghu Island cable cut, where that Chinese captain's now been indicted, served his trial, and is now serving jail time for 3 years, that incident took place in the territorial waters of Taiwan, between the Penghu Islands and Taiwan. So they had all the legal jurisdiction they needed. However, they wanted to deter, Taiwan's authorities wanted to deter impacts of events that would take place outside, to make sure that they had a legal precedent, or at least a legal study done, so that they would know what would happen if this took place in the exclusive economic zone or beyond in Taiwan. And so what happened was they released a legal study that said that under Article 4 of Taiwan's criminal code, if any sort of acts happen outside of Taiwan's exclusive economic zone, like a cable cut or something like this, if that has an impact on the people of Taiwan or of the Taiwanese government or anything like that, Taiwanese state, then guess what? They can prosecute, or they can at least issue an indictment. And so it's very similar to when a democracy, Germany does this, U.S. does this. If you have a corrupt actor that's preying upon our citizens, they may be able to indict. Prosecutors will indict that person or that entity abroad, even if they can't necessarily have them extradited to serve trial. They at least can offer an indictment. Certainly, when the Trump administration went after Maduro, that's what they did, right? So look, here's the bottom line. Taiwan set up this point to say that just like international corruption cases, they should be able to go after vessels and captains if they break the cables outside of their territorial waters. And so that, I think, is the lesson that the Baltic Sea littoral states need to take.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay. So Benjamin, let us now focus on the Nord Stream case, because this,
Sure.
of course, a highly political topic, especially for us Germans. And at this point, me as a German, I'd like to apologize to the Ukrainian audience that it was the Germans who pushed it through against all odds, and they built this pipeline. I have nothing to do with it, and I was against it from the very beginning. And when it has been blown up, my first reaction was, great. Fine, fantastic. But the reaction of my fellow Germans, many of those, and of the media, was the other way around. They said, "Oh, somebody destroyed our critical infrastructure. This is not our, yeah,
right,
yeah, and this is not good. How shall we heat in the winter?" And that's a crazy topic. And me myself, I'm also astonished about this Andromeda sailboat thing, and that it has been the Ukrainians, but there have been also in the beginning rumors that the Americans have done it, but the Russians themselves should have done it. And so, could you please give me your opinion on that? Well,
I won't give you my opinion. I'm going to give you our analytical assessment from our academic study. So our Underwater Mayhem project is trying to basically look at the pathologies of all of these sort of incidents. We're publishing what we can based on a number of factors. So starting with field research, actually going to the infrastructure, better understanding the infrastructure, then talking to experts that work on that sort of infrastructure, experts and engineers that work on subsea pipelines and cables, people that have done deep sea diving, people who have done military operations and things like this, and then go outside of that to talk to first responders, Coast Guard, police, militaries that actually responded to these incidents. And only once you integrate all of that technical data, which of course includes not only interviews with people, but also satellite data, geospatial data, AIS data showing where vessels were, things like this, putting all of that together, then we go out and talk to experts in the geopolitical and political realm to give context to what we're finding. So that's the sort of methods that we're using. So based on that, we assessed as improbable that the Ukrainians on a pro-Ukraine sailboat, the Andromeda, were able to do this sort of sabotage of Nord Stream, and we found as probable that the Russian Federation was involved in this. You might say, why? There's been a lot of press on the Andromeda. Certainly, that seems like an open and shut case. Well, the answer is much more difficult than that, and I'm happy to go through the data if you'd like. So look, I can only really comment on what we found in our data. And so what we have is data that shows, and this came, some of the satellite data came from a pan-Nordic public journalist investigation that went on, that showed that there were Russian seabed warfare capable vessels at the Nord Stream 1 blast site northeast of Bornholm 4 days before the blast took place. Those also were there, those same vessels, 3 months before the blast took place. So that was from the public broadcaster. They showed that. Again, these are not just any Russian vessels. These are vessels that are specifically designed to do seabed warfare operations. They have the capabilities and the technologies on board to do this. Mm-hmm. Separately, we found in our data that during the construction process of Nord Stream 2, that was going on in 2021, after U.S. sanctions had stopped Western vessels from being involved in the construction of Nord Stream, that we found that there were Russian vessels that sat directly over what would become the Nord Stream 2 blast site southeast of Bornholm for many weeks at a time during the course of 2021. And the exact location that the Russians took over to basically build Nord Stream 2 after those sanctions had stopped construction a year earlier in 2020, that exact location was the location of the southern blast site in the Nord Stream case. And so that really can't be overlooked. And so we looked and said, okay, are there, dark vessels operating in that data set, when they were constructing it? And indeed, we found dark vessels operating without their automatic identification systems switched on. So that's part of this as well. There have been think tank reports that showed, or at least claimed, that there were Russian military vessels going in and out of the construction fleet in 2021, and those reports were contemporaneous, not in retrospect, to this happening. And then we also looked at where was this supposed sailboat operation launched from? Well, it was launched from Hoaduna, which is a marina across from Warnemünde in the port of Rostock. And that sailboat port was directly next to, the marina was directly next to, guess what, a Nord Stream 2 operated logistics center that the Russians operated all throughout 2021. So again, it really is questionable why a pro-Ukraine operation would not only launch an anti-Russian operation, not only from arguably the most politically pro-Russian region around the Baltic Sea outside of Russia, which is Mecklenburg-Vorpommern,
yes,
but also from a rental facility directly adjacent to a Nord Stream logistics center. So these are the sort of things that we keep questioning. And look, Christoph, there's a lot more of this story that needs to be thoroughly analyzed. There's a Lloyd's case in London where Nord Stream itself is suing Lloyd's, which is a insurer, for damages for this incident. And there's a lot of technical documentation and technical testimony from experts that draws questions on whether the sailboat really could have pulled off this operation in the way that it has been covered in the press, or is it actually just being used as a red herring, in other words, kind of a distraction, something that went around, it was able to be picked up and followed basically, and to create a diversion for the Russians to have done this with the capabilities that they have on site. And so we need to see how this ultimately turns out. So
from your point of view, it's highly probable that it have been the Russians. They have done it. We assess as probable that the Russian Federation was involved in the Nord Stream case. That is absolutely still our assessment until we have more tangible data and evidence released, and I hope it will be released ultimately by the Danish, Swedish, and German investigation so that the public can really understand the extent of what's going on. But based on the open source intelligence that we have gathered and we have presented in Underwater Mayhem, based on the interviews with actual technical experts that understand what is going on with these infrastructure and how these sort of operations can or cannot take place, and the level of safety and risk mitigation that these sort of supposed clandestine operations could take place, it really raises a lot of questions. And even if the narrative of a sailboat being involved in this sort of thing, if those narratives are out there, then only one thing happens, right? Only one of these bins, one of these culprits is out there. And so far, the books that I have reviewed and the news articles that I've reviewed have never gone into significant amount of technical analysis. In fact, have done very little technical analysis and tried to elide over the fact that the Russians were there with saying that, Christoph, that they were in fact there to, quote, protect the pipeline, when in fact they were also there well before the sailboat ever sailed. And even if they, quote unquote, caught wind of the operation, they were also there 18 months before the operation, even in the telling in the German press, ever was thought of. So there's got to be a way in which we can rectify and put all these puzzle pieces together, because I think what's going on in the German press, you have kind of a scoop and source based pieces of the puzzle where they're interviewing people that they think are they believe are involved, and they're giving information. I'm not saying all that information is wrong. It's just part of the puzzle up here. We have all of this technical data down here, and there's got to be pieces that connect them somehow, because unlike a political debate, this is an incident, an actual physical incident that took place. And so only one thing happened. So we'll have to find out and keep following the story as this comes together. That's the point. Only one truth can be there. Right. None else. It's not quantum mechanical. This is not Schrodinger's pipeline. Yes, right? Yes. The pipe is not destroyed and not destroyed at the same time. Right. That's the cat is not alive and dead at the same time. That's the point. And that brings me to the question: when it have been the Russians, then, I mean, you explained it to me already, but please tell it to our viewers also. Why do the Russians hurt themselves and kill their own pipeline, which brings money to them, and they need money, the Russians. So this project is a very important money bringer project for the Russians, and they blew it up. Why? Why would the Russians destroy their own pipeline? Right. Okay, so I've been asked that a lot. That has come out in the press a lot, and it's asked in a way that is dismissed almost out of hand, because why would the Russians destroy their own pipeline? Okay, we're moving on to the next subject then. The answer is this: you have to look back at what was actually going on with the operations of the pipeline
energy-wise before this incident took place. And what had been happening was the Russians had cut the gas already in June of 2022 by 40%. So they were only bringing 60% of the gas through Nord Stream 1. Of course, Nord Stream 2 never came into operation because of sanctions, thank God. And so in June of 2022, the Russians were weaponizing energy and putting pressure on Germany and countries around Europe by cutting gas through Nord Stream 1. They claimed that they needed Siemens turbines to be released from Canada that were undergoing repairs. And so they were basically weaponizing energy, the Russians, in order to get relief in technology export controls. And ultimately, unfortunately, they succeeded. The German government worked with the Biden administration to put pressure on Ottawa to get Ottawa to make the decision to send at least one of those turbines back to Germany, where they were supposed to then send it on to the Russian Federation so they could, fix the problem. Yeah. Of course, famously, Olaf Scholz, even after more cuts that got down to 40% of operations by August, Olaf Scholz famously stood next to the turbine. The Russians wouldn't take it back, and then by September 1st of 2022, the Russians had cut the Nord Stream 1 gas by 100%. And Dmitry Peskov, the press spokesman of the Kremlin, came out and said that this is actually for sanctions purposes. In other words, if you unsanction Nord Stream 2, or if you unsanction other things, maybe we'll send gas through it. And he even says other reasons for the cut cannot be explained. So in other words, it's not a technical problem in the end. They were weaponizing energy the full way. And of course, a few weeks later, the Nord Stream blasts take place. And then shortly thereafter, the Kremlin keeps this line of, well, 3 of the 4 pipelines are destroyed, but one's still there. But if you only unsanction the 4th pipeline, the one that's still intact of Nord Stream 2, we could send gas through it tomorrow. In other words, trying to undermine Europe's energy security by increasing their dependence again, once again, on Russian energy. Mm-hmm. So why would the Russians blow it up if they did, right? And again, we're not binary. We're not saying yes, the Russians did, no, the Ukrainians did not. We're putting this on an estimative language chart based on our data. And so we say about 70% or probable that the Russians were involved. Well, there was a motivation because the Russians certainly were cutting off gas for political purposes in the months leading up to the incident. That they would be sued for because of non-deliveries to, companies in Germany and France and elsewhere. And so they could have gone and tried to do this for a force majeure scenario. In other words, the pipeline's blown up, and our claims simply, the legal claims that were becoming, millions of dollars a day, that would get up into the, billions of dollars range pretty quickly. They would not be viable because of force majeure. Yeah. And so with that context in mind, one has to then look back, have the Russians ever done something like this? And there are reports that they have. In Central Asia in 2008 and 2009, there was reports of suddenly the electricity and gas infrastructure on the Russian side of the border around Georgia and in Kazakhstan, et cetera. There's examples you can look up in the press where suddenly, pylons were blown up and there's, pieces of these infrastructure that got destroyed to get a force majeure scenario in that case. So certainly it would not put this past the Russian Federation. And no, it is not any way out of the realm of the possible that the Russians would, quote unquote, why would they blow up their own pipelines? Because this is their MO. This is their modus operandi. They do these sort of things.
They do things that ordinary people would never do, and
it goes against their own interest too, right? A full-scale invasion of Ukraine goes against Russian interest.
Absolutely.
So this is certainly in the bin of the probable based on that.
Yeah, and they seem to have fun with this. They see that their opponents, we are absolutely shocked and we don't know what's going on, and they seem to like this. The Nord Stream case, I'm very curious on your release, what you're bringing out. I guess there will be some more publications.
There is. So we're working on right now. So we've already released Underwater Mayhem Volume 1 that came out in May of 2025 that has case studies on both the Swalbart or Spitsbergen case that I mentioned earlier. Mm-hmm. It also has about 75 pages on the Nord Stream case with all the gory details of all the technical analysis, interviews, data. And I want to call on the German press in particular to take a look at those case studies because we got technical experts to go in at length on the record and go through what is possible and what is not possible in terms of diving operations, in terms of subsea explosives, in terms of how the Russians operate in the clandestine space. Those are all there in addition to all of our satellite and AIS data. And I think that it's, in the public interest for not only scoop and source-based reporting, but also technical reporting that either verifies or has to, it's not going to be clean, right? It's not always going to be, I talked to this guy, he said this, she said this, and we're done. You also have to figure out, okay, but this is unlike normal political, sort of he said, she said. This is a physical act that only one thing could have possibly happened, and so you need technical analysis to back that up as well.
Very interesting. And where are those information available?
You can find that at the University of Pennsylvania's Kleinman Center for Energy Policy. It's on our website there. I'm happy to share a link that you can share in the notes of this episode, description of this episode. I will also say that Underwater Mayhem Volume 2 is coming soon. And so we will be publishing that in the coming months. That will basically go through and complete our case studies on the rest of the Baltic Sea cases that I mentioned, especially in the Gulf of Finland and the Central Baltic, the cables and the pipelines that were cut and destroyed there, and then also in Taiwan. And then, of course, the corollary, what is going on in the Antarctic treaty system. And that's one of the last things I wanted to talk about today, Christoph, if I could, which is that the Russians, since 2020, when I actually was down on the ice in the South Pole Station, Amundsen South Pole Station, working on a telescope called Bicep Array for Harvard University at that time. When I got off of the ice, I found out that in the press, there were reports that the Russians had been shooting seismic, looking for oil and gas in the Southern Ocean within the Antarctic treaty system. Okay, that goes against the Antarctic Treaty, not to mention it's bad for the climate, it's not economically viable, all these sort of things, but it undermines an international agreement. But what's more, when we started to look at those same vessels, Christoph, as they sail up and down from the Antarctic over the past 5 years, looking for oil and gas when they get down there, they've also been stopping and loitering over subsea cables in the mid-Atlantic, suddenly stopping their voyage and sailing over cables that connect things like the South America to the New York Stock Exchange or West Africa to South America, et cetera, right? These sort of things are concerning. And we've also seen vessels that show up both around sabotage incidents. So that vessel, the Russian nuclear class icebreaker Sevmerput, that's been also sent down there as well. So there's a lot of these kind of interlocking characteristics in that region as well. So all of that's coming in Underwater Mayhem Volume 2, hopefully out in fall 2026, so just a few months away.
Wow, that is very interesting. Looking forward to read all that stuff, and I'm sure that pretty many journalists also will be happy to read that.
Great, yeah, happy to. Our whole point here, this is an academic exercise to try to get as much data as we can, analyze it to the extent we can, and then hand it off to the professionals in investigative journalists to go the rest of the way.
The journalists and the politicians,
and of course the politicians.
Of course.
Right.
So thank you so much. Now, Benjamin, that was very, very interesting and insightful. I'm very humbled of the knowledge and the data you got, and it's a lot to think about. Thank you so much, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you.
Hopefully we can meet again.
Absolutely, and the only one thing I'll say to the end of this is Slava Ukraine.
Heroyam Slava, and also once again to the audience who has made it up to here, please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done that, and give a like, all that stuff. Take care. Okay, bye bye.
Thank you so much. Vielen Dank.
Thank you so much. Bye bye, Benjamin.
Bye.